The difference between a successful dive and a submarine disaster is often measured in seconds. On May 23, 1939, at about 7:40 in the morning, the USS Squalus was conducting a test dive off the Isles of Shoals near Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She was a state-of-the-art Sargo-class boat preparing for a high-speed test dive. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Oliver Naquin, gave the order to submerge. The alarm sounded. The vents opened. The hull slipped beneath the Atlantic waves. In the control room, the crew watched the indicator panel as the lights for the hull openings flipped from red to green. Rows of bulbs meant to confirm every critical opening was secured. On paper, the boat was sealed. In reality, the indications were wrong. The main engine air induction valve is the lungs of a diesel submarine. It is a massive air intake designed to feed the thirsty engines while the ship runs on the surface. When the ship dives, this valve must slam shut to seal the pressure hull against the ocean. The Christmas tree in the control room showed the valve was closed. In reality, the mechanical gate was wide open. As the Squalus dipped below the surface, the Atlantic Ocean found the 30-inch opening. Thousands of gallons of seawater did not trickle in. They roared into the engine rooms with the force of a freight train. The physics of a submarine rely on neutral buoyancy, where the weight of the ship exactly equals the weight of the water it displaces. The flooding shattered this balance instantly. Tons of water flooded the aft compartments, creating a catastrophic stern-heavy condition. The ship stopped diving and began to fall. The angle of the deck steepened rapidly, throwing men and equipment against the bulkheads. In the engine rooms, the crew had zero chance. The water ingress was so violent it likely killed them by impact before they could even drown. In the control room, Lieutenant Naquin faced a decision that defines the burden of command. The ship was dying. The aft half of the vessel was already lost. The water was rushing forward toward the battery compartments and the control room itself. If the water reached the batteries, it would mix with the acid to create chlorine gas, a deadly chemical agent that would kill everyone left alive. If the water breached the control room, the ship would be lost with all hands. Naquin ordered the manual closing of the watertight door between the operating compartments and the flooding engine rooms. A crewman slammed the heavy steel door shut and locked the dogs. This action saved the ship, but it sealed the fate of 26 men trapped on the wrong side of the steel. They were gone. The Squalus continued her plunge, hitting the bottom at about 240 feet, roughly 40 fathoms. She landed stern first, then settled until her bow was raised at an 11-degree angle. The immediate violence was over, but the slow death had just begun. 33 survivors, 32 crewmen, and 1 civilian were alive in the forward torpedo room and the control room. They were trapped on the sea floor, far beyond the reach of standard escape lungs. The pressure outside the hull was over 100 pounds per square inch. Inside the hull, the air was growing colder by the hour as the steel equalized towards sea temperature. Cold stress joined bad air as a second clock. The real countdown, though, was chemical, oxygen falling and carbon dioxide climbing. In a sealed environment, humans consume oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. As the hours tick by, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide rises. It is an insidious toxin. At low levels, it causes headaches and confusion. At high levels, it causes unconsciousness and death. The survivors had a limited volume of air. They could add oxygen from emergency banks and use chemical absorbent, soda lime carried in their gear, to slow the rise of carbon dioxide, but they were still racing chemistry. They were sitting in a steel bottle that was slowly filling with poison. The crew deployed a marker buoy that released a telephone cable to the surface, but they knew the odds. No submarine crew had ever been rescued from this depth. The water pressure at 243 feet is a physical wall that crushes standard diving equipment. The ocean does not negotiate. The men of the Squalus settled into the darkness, waiting for the air to turn toxic or for the hull to implode. They had survived the fall, but now they had to survive the wait. They would remain trapped for roughly 39 hours. At 11:30 on May 24th, USS Falcon lowered the McCann Rescue Chamber, and over the next 13 hours, 4 trips brought all 33 survivors up. The problem was pressure. If a sailor were to simply exit the escape hatch and swim for the surface, the expanding air in his lungs would rupture his tissues, or the nitrogen bubbles in his blood would cripple him. They could not swim up. A machine had to go down. This machine was the McCann Rescue Chamber. The chamber is an engineering marvel designed to cheat the ocean. It looks like an inverted steel pear. Unlike a standard diving bell which dangles passively from a crane, the McCann chamber drives itself. It relies on a specific component called the downhaul cable. First, a diver must descend to the submarine and attach a steel cable to the center of the escape hatch. The chamber then threads this cable through its own internal winch. It does not rely on the heaving surface ship to lower it. Instead, the chamber motors itself down the cable hand over hand like a climber on a rope until it sits directly on top of the submarine hatch. Once the chamber lands on the submarine, the physics of the seal become critical. The chamber rests on a rubber gasket. The operators inside the bell pump out the water between the chamber and the submarine hull. The immense weight of the ocean presses the chamber down, creating a watertight seal that is stronger than any mechanical latch. With the water removed, the pressure is equalized. The submarine hatch can be opened. The survivors transfer from the foul air of the wreck into the clean air of the bell. The hatch is resealed and the chamber unspools its winch to float back to the surface. The operation required 4 trips to bring up all 33 men. The first 3 runs were tense but successful. The chamber proved the concept worked, but the ocean always demands attacks. On the 4th and final trip, carrying the last 8 survivors, including Lieutenant McCann, the system failed. On the final trip, the evolution nearly failed when the downhaul wire malfunctioned, and the chamber could not be raised normally. The crew stabilized the bell and worked the problem without panicking. The last lift took hours instead of minutes. The chamber jammed. It could not go up. It could not go down. It was paralyzed in the water column, hanging by a damaged thread. Inside the bell, the air began to stale. The occupants were suspended in a steel coffin midway between the surface and the bottom. The solution required a level of nerve that defies instinct. They could not force the winch, or the cable would snap, dropping them 80 feet back to the bottom. They had to make the chamber heavy. They flooded the ballast tanks to sink the chamber back down toward the submarine to take the tension off the wire. Then divers had to descend into the pitch-black freezing water to manually cut the steel cable. Communication during this crisis was primitive. Earlier in the operation, the telephone cable to the surface had snapped. The survivors and divers resorted to striking the steel walls with hammers. They tapped out messages in Morse code, sending vibrations through the hull to signal their status. This crude percussion was their only link to the world of the living. Once the cable was cut, the chamber was hauled up by hand using a safety line. It was a delicate operation where a single slip meant death. But the line held. The chamber broke the surface. Every single man who had survived the initial flooding was brought home alive. The rescue was a total success. But as the USS Falcon turned for port, she left behind a tomb containing 26 bodies and a 1,400-ton warship. The survivors were safe, but the Squalus herself was now a dead weight in the mud, presenting an engineering challenge that would make the rescue look simple. The rescue of the 33 survivors was a miracle of mechanical engineering, but the salvage of the hull itself was a war against physiology. The USS Squalus lay at a depth of 243 feet. In 1939, this depth was considered the absolute limit of human endurance. The barrier was not the cold or the darkness. The barrier was the air itself. At sea level, the air we breathe is roughly 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. It is benign. But as a diver descends, the pressure increases by 1 atmosphere for every 33 feet of depth. At 240 feet, the pressure is over 7 times greater than at the surface. Under this immense crushing weight, the nitrogen in the air transforms from an inert gas into a potent narcotic. This phenomenon is known as nitrogen narcosis. It does not damage the body physically like the bends, but it destroys the mind. As the partial pressure of nitrogen rises, it saturates the fatty tissues of the brain, interfering with the transmission of nerve impulses. A diver at this depth breathing standard air behaves as if he is severely intoxicated. His judgment fails. He may forget his mission, discard his regulator, or simply drift into a euphoric stupor until his air runs out. You cannot entrust a complex salvage operation involving heavy rigging and explosives to men who are effectively drunk. To salvage Squalus, the Navy had to change the chemistry of breathing gas and decompression. Divers used helium-oxygen mixtures and experimental surface decompression procedures to make deep work possible. By replacing the nitrogen in the breathing mix with helium, engineers eliminated the narcotic effect. Helium is an inert gas with a low molecular weight and low solubility in fat. It does not react with the brain tissue. It allows a diver to remain clear-headed and sharp even at crushing depths where nitrogen would be lethal. However, helium introduces a bizarre side effect that complicates operations. The density of helium is much lower than that of air. When it passes through the human vocal cords, it changes the resonant frequency of the voice. The tough salvage divers working in the freezing darkness of the Atlantic found themselves speaking in high-pitched, squeaky voices that sounded like cartoon characters. This phenomenon, known as the Donald Duck effect, was more than just a curiosity. It made communication over the telephone lines difficult, requiring topside operators to listen with extreme focus to decipher the reports coming from the bottom. With the chemistry of the dive solved, the physical work could begin. The divers were not just visiting the wreck, they were engaging in heavy industrial labor. They had to tunnel underneath the hull to rig the lifting chains. Using high-pressure water hoses, they blasted tunnels through the stiff clay of the ocean floor. It was brutal work performed in total darkness and near freezing temperatures. They battled the mud, the currents, and the constant threat of entanglement. For 3 months, the divers worked in rotation. They sliced through the steel chaos of the deck. They sealed the open valves. They prepared the ship for the lift. They had conquered the biological limits of the deep using helium, but they were about to face a problem that chemistry could not solve. They were preparing to lift 1,400 tons of dead weight using nothing but air and the physics of buoyancy. The divers had done their job, but the ocean was waiting to strike back with a violent lesson in expansion mechanics. To raise 1,400 tons of steel from the ocean floor, you cannot simply pull on a rope. The weight of the water-filled hull combined with the drag of the water column would snap any cable manufactured in 1939. The engineers had to turn the ocean against itself. They used the principle of buoyancy. If they could attach enough air-filled containers to the sunken hull, the ship would become lighter than the water surrounding it and float to the surface on its own. The tools for this job were salvage pontoons. These were massive steel cylinders measuring 32 feet in length and 12 feet in diameter. In the salvage trade, they are known as camels. Each pontoon, when fully blown dry, could generate 80 tons of lift. The plan was to strap these pontoons to the Squalus using heavy chains swept under the keel. By pumping compressed air into the pontoons, the water inside them would be forced out, replacing dead weight with buoyant force. But the calculations were complicated by a phenomenon known as mud suction. The Squalus was not merely resting on the seabed, she was embedded in it. The thick clay of the ocean floor had gripped the hull, creating a vacuum seal along the keel. To break this seal, the salvage team had to generate far more lift than the actual weight of the ship. They had to rip the submarine out of the earth. This requirement to overpower the mud set a trap based on the physics of gas expansion known as Boyle's law. As a bubble of air rises in the water column, the pressure surrounding it decreases. This causes the air to expand. If you release a bubble from about 240 feet, its volume expands by roughly 8 times as it rises to the surface. When the hull breaks free, the same expansion turns controlled lift into runaway lift if you try to do it in one shot. It begins to rise. As it rises, the air in the pontoons and the ballast tanks expands rapidly, increasing the lift force. This creates a runaway feedback loop. The faster it rises, the more the air expands and the faster it accelerates. On July 13th, the salvage team initiated the first lift. They began to blow air into the pontoons. At first, the operation seemed controlled. The stern broke free and rose a few feet as planned. But then the bow lost its battle with the mud. It tore free from the suction with violent abruptness. The buoyancy force, which had been ramped up to fight the mud, was now unopposed. The Squalus did not float to the surface. She shot upward like a missile. The expanding air inside the hull and the pontoons accelerated the 1,400-ton wreck to a terrifying speed. In seconds, the submarine covered the vertical distance that had taken the divers months to rig. The bow of the Squalus erupted from the ocean surface, breaching 30 feet into the air in a spray of white water and mud. The scene was chaotic. The massive pontoons were tossed around like bathtub toys. Thick hoses snapped and whipped through the air. The heavy lifting chains clashed and tangled. This uncontrolled surfacing was so violent that the salvage crew nicknamed it the Mad Tornado. The submarine hung suspended in the air for a brief moment before gravity reclaimed her. She crashed back into the ocean and plummeted straight back to the bottom. The failure was total. The ship slammed back into the mud almost where she had started, only now the cables, hoses, and pontoons were a snarled knot of steel and rubber. The divers had to go down again to cut away the wreckage of their own rigging, then rebuild the lift from scratch. The failure of the first lift taught the Navy a brutal lesson in physics. You cannot simply overpower the ocean with buoyancy. If you try to bring a submarine from 240 feet to the surface in a single motion, the expansion of air will always win. The engineers had to abandon the idea of a direct ascent. They had to dismantle the problem and solve it in pieces. They adopted a strategy known in the trade as blow and tow. The logic of blow and tow is based on control. Instead of aiming for the surface, the salvage team aimed for a midway point. They rigged the pontoons to lift the Squalus only 80 feet off the bottom. At this depth, the ship was still submerged, suspended in the water column like a pendulum. While she was hovering the surface, ships would tow her toward the shore until the keel grounded on the rising seabed. By intentionally crashing the ship back into the mud in shallower water, they reset the physics. They could then re-rig the pontoons, adjust the chains, and prepare for another short controlled lift. This step-by-step approach neutralized the threat of runaway expansion. By limiting the vertical distance of each lift, the engineers kept the air pressure inside the pontoons within a manageable range. It turned a chaotic rocket launch into a slow, methodical staircase climb. But before they could execute this new plan, the divers had to undo the damage of the mad tornado. They spent weeks cutting through the snarled spaghetti of steel cable and rubber hose that littered the deck. It was slow, dangerous work performed in the shadow of the hull that had already tried to kill them once. On the second attempt, the physics held. The pontoons were inflated. The Squalus broke free from the mud suction gently. She rose and hovered. The tow ship strained against the current, dragging the underwater ghost closer to the naval shipyard in Portsmouth. They grounded her, re-rigged, and lifted again. It was a tedious cycle of lift tow and ground, moving the massive weight from the crushing dark of the open ocean to the shallow safety of the harbor. During these operations, the ocean claimed its final toll. The Squalus was a tomb containing 26 men. As the ship was jostled and towed, the currents flushed water through the damaged engine compartments. When the hull was finally drained, one body was missing. It is believed that one of the crewmen was washed out of the hull during the transit, lost forever to the sea. 25 men would come home for burial. One would remain on patrol. By mid-September 1939, the final lift and tow brought Squalus into dry dock at Portsmouth, more than 3 months after she sank. The stage process had walked the hull from deep water into controlled shallows. The pontoons were inflated for the last time. The bow broke the surface, followed by the stern. This time there was no violent breach. The submarine wallowed on the surface, stable and secure. The salvage ships moved in to secure the wreck. The pumps began to roar, emptying the millions of gallons of Atlantic water that had claimed the ship back in May. The operation had taken relentless, boundary-pushing labor. It had pushed the boundaries of diving physiology and salvage engineering. The Navy had proven that a submarine could be rescued and that a hull could be recovered from depths previously thought impossible. The Squalus was floating again. She was rusted, covered in marine growth, and filled with the wreckage of a tragedy. Most observers looked at the hulk and saw scrap metal. The Navy looked at the hulk and saw a weapon of war. The ship was back on the surface, but her story was not over because she had a war to fight. 113 days. That is the precise number of days the USS Squalus spent on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. When the pumps finally drained the hull in the Portsmouth dry dock, the interior was a scene of devastation. The delicate electrical systems were corroded by salt water. The bulkheads were coated in oil and river mud. The ship carried the heavy silence of the men who had died in the aft compartments. In the eyes of the public, the ship was a tomb. But in the eyes of the Navy, she was a hull that had passed the ultimate stress test. She had survived crushing depth and a violent recovery. The Navy does not typically sail ghost ships. There is a deep superstition among mariners about vessels that have killed their crews. To break the curse, the Navy stripped the Squalus of her identity. They repaired the faulty high induction valve, the mechanism that had betrayed the crew on that May morning. They rewired the control board and scrubbed the interior. On February 9, 1940, the submarine was renamed Sailfish. She would be recommissioned after repairs on May 15, 1940. The Sailfish was sent to the Pacific to fight the Japanese Empire. She earned the nickname the Squalefish among submariners who remembered her dark origin. But she proved to be a lethal predator. She conducted 12 war patrols and sank thousands of tons of enemy shipping. Yet the ocean seems to possess a grim sense of irony. The history of the Squalus and the Sailfish is bound together by a tragic coincidence involving her sister ship, the USS Sculpin. It was the Sculpin that had first located the Squalus in 1939. It was the Sculpin that stood by while the Falcon lowered the rescue chamber. In 1943, the Sculpin was lost in battle, forced to scuttle after a brutal depth charge attack. Her survivors were picked up by a Japanese destroyer and transferred to the aircraft carrier Chuyo. Days later, the Sailfish intercepted the Chuyo in a heavy typhoon. The radar conditions were poor and the seas were rough, echoing the chaos of the Salvage years before. The captain of the Sailfish ordered the attack. He fired a spread of torpedoes that tore the Japanese carrier apart. The Sailfish had scored a major victory, but she did not know the cargo she had destroyed. The Chuyo went down carrying the American prisoners of war from the Sculpin. The ship that had been saved in 1939 had unknowingly killed the men from the ship that saved her. It is one of the darkest paradoxes in naval history. Beyond the tragedy of the war, the legacy of the Squalus operation transformed the world of marine salvage. The success of the McCann Rescue Chamber proved that entrapment on the bottom was not a death sentence. The chamber became standard equipment on rescue vessels for decades. The use of helium and oxygen to combat nitrogen narcosis opened the continental shelf to human intervention. The divers who squeaked like cartoons in the freezing darkness had pioneered the techniques that would later allow the offshore oil industry to build the infrastructure of the modern world. The phrase "take her down" was the last command Lieutenant Naquin gave before the Squalus flooded. It was a command that led to disaster, but it was also the command that the Sailfish followed time and again as she dove to attack the enemy. The ship proved that a vessel could die and return to life. The 26 men lost in the engine rooms remain on eternal patrol, but the hull they served became a legend, not for how she sank, but for the sheer engineering stubbornness required to bring her back. The salvage of the Squalus was more than a technical feat. It was a statement that even at 240 feet, the ocean does not get to keep what belongs to the United States Navy.